The frost clung stubbornly to the buffalo grass, each blade catching the first threads of light spilling over the far ridge. The young hunter stepped out into the brittle air, boots crunching on snow packed by weeks of wind. He carried his rifle loosely but ready, the leather strap worn to a soft polish against his shoulder. His horse, tethered by the cabin, turned its head to watch him, steam curling from its nostrils. The world felt hollowed out in that hour before the sun truly woke. Only the sound of his own breathing and, far off, a lone wolf's howl rolling over the mesa. He paused. The howl tapered into silence, leaving the prairie strangely still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. He had learned to listen for such pauses. They often carried weight. Adjusting the brim of his hat, he started toward the ridge, the rifle's barrel glinting faintly in the low light. Tracks caught his attention, a neat line of deer prints stitched into the snow. He followed them down a shallow draw, each step sending up a whisper of powder. The prints were fresh, sharp at the edges, but 100 paces on they scattered wildly, zigzagging as though something had burst upon them. He knelt, touching the churned snow. Deep impressions, wide pads, claws scoring the crust. Wolves. More than one. The smell of them was faint but undeniable, a musky shadow against the clean cold. A crow flapped overhead, black wings harsh against the pale sky. He rose, scanning the slopes. The air was clear enough to see half a mile, and yet a feeling pressed against him, low in the gut. He moved quicker now, weaving through a line of twisted junipers. Somewhere ahead, faint but rising, a sound bled into the stillness, a scream. It was sharp, human, ragged at the edges. He broke into a run, rifle steady in his hands. Cresting the ridge, he saw them, a small clearing below. Snow churned into a frenzy of movement. A woman, crouched low, her bow shattered in the drifts, a sleeve torn dark with blood. 4 wolves circled her, their eyes bright, tails stiff, bodies taut with hunger. He didn't think, only raise a rifle. The crack split the air, echoing hard off the rocks. One wolf dropped, jerking in the snow. The others snarled, shifting their focus toward him. The woman stumbled backward, eyes wide, but didn't scream again. He descended fast, boots sliding. The second shot took another wolf mid-leap, the body twisting before hitting the ground. The last 2 lunged, teeth flashing. He swung the rifle like a club, the wood smashing into a jaw with a sick crack. The 4th came in low, fast enough that he smelled its breath before the barrel found its side. The blast was deafening at that range. Snow settled in a sudden, eerie quiet. The bodies lay scattered, steam curling from their wounds. His breath came hard, frosty in the cold. The woman was on her knees. One hand pressed her arm, blood seeping through her fingers. He approached slowly, lowering the rifle. Her gaze met his, sharp, guarded, but not afraid. Words formed on her lips, but he didn't catch them. The language rolled differently, with rhythms he didn't know. He pointed toward the ridge, toward his cabin beyond it. She hesitated, then let him help her to her feet. They moved through the trees in silence, the wind rising to rattle the branches. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was a soft burn of gold at the edges. He pushed open the door, guiding her inside. The smell of pine smoke and boiled coffee met them. He stoked the fire higher, its light catching in her dark hair as she sank onto the wooden bench. Her wound was deep but clean. He fetched a tin of boiled water, a strip of linen torn from an old shirt, and began wrapping the arm with slow, practiced hands. She watched him without flinching, her eyes following the sure movements. When he was done, she murmured something low. Thanks, maybe, though he couldn't be certain. The cabin was sparse. A small table, a single bed frame of buffalo hide thrown over it, shelves lined with tins of dried meat and beans. A rifle leaned in the corner beside a skinning knife. She took it all in with a glance that lingered on the door before shifting back to the fire. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, the sound of it restless, unsettled. He set a pot of coffee to boil, the hiss and pop of fire filling the silence. She didn't ask why he lived alone. He didn't ask what had driven her into the wolves' teeth. When she finally lay back to rest, her face turned toward the warmth, he stood a moment watching the firelight play across the walls. That feeling from earlier, Something pressing in from the edges of the land hadn't left. If anything, it had settled deeper. He poured himself a tin cup of coffee and moved to the door, stepping out into the fading light. The snow beyond the porch stretched unbroken to the tree line, where the shadows had thickened into something almost solid. He thought he saw movement there, low and slow, but the wind stole the shape from him. He stayed a long while, listening. Only the prairie's wide silence answered back, but it was the kind that didn't last. The light came thin through the frost on the windows, painting the inside of the cabin in a pale silver. He stirred the fire with the end of his boot, coaxing the embers to life. She was awake, sitting on the bench where he'd left her, her injured arm resting in her lap. The bandage had held. She regarded him with the steady gaze of someone who measured people before trusting them. He poured coffee into a tin cup and slid across the table. She hesitated, then took it with her good hand, lifting it to her lips. The steam curled upward, carrying the sharp scent into the cold air between them. She drank without a word, but he saw the tension in her shoulders ease just enough to notice. While she drank, he checked his supplies. A few strips of dried venison, 2 jars of beans, a small sack of flour. Winter didn't forgive waste, and there wasn't much to spare. She seemed to notice quiet tallying, her eyes moving from shelf to shelf as if memorizing what he had. It wasn't suspicion so much as caution. When he stepped outside to check the snare line, she followed, moving slower but steady on her feet. The snow was thin where the sun had touched it, crusted where the cold had held it fast. They walked to the creek that cut through the valley, its edges locked in ice. He knelt to break through the surface with a flat stone, and she crouched opposite him, her reflection fractured in the ripples. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, a thin gray finger pointing at the sky from somewhere east. He noticed at the moment she did, her gaze fixed on it, the crease deepening between her brows. When she spoke, it was an English touched by another tongue. "Men come," she said, then added after a pause, "They take." He didn't ask how she knew. The tone told him enough. Still, the words left a tightness in his chest. The land out here was wide and empty to most eyes, but he knew there were always eyes watching, always someone willing to claim what another had built. Back at the cabin, they ate in silence, the only sound the dull scrape of tin spoons on the bowls. Later, as night began its slow creep in, he set another log on the fire. She sat across from him, watching the flames. The shadows moved along the walls, bending with the flicker. She began to speak, not in a rush, but as if turning over each word before giving it voice. She told him of her people's camp in the low canyon, how the soldiers had come at the turn of winter, driving them from the only shelter they had. She had been separated in the chaos, her horse bolting into the hills. The wolves had found her before she found anyone else. He didn't interrupt. His own past pressed at the edges of his mind, memories he had no intention of sharing. Still, something in her voice, the quiet weight of it, made him feel the distance between his own solitude and hers. They were both, in different ways, living at the edge of what could be taken from them. The wind shifted outside, carried with it the faintest sound of hooves on snow. He raised his head, listening. She heard it too. The firelight caught the glint in her eyes, sharper now, alert. They waited, breaths held, until the sound faded into the trees. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered out into the dark. Nothing moved but the wind-blown snow. Still the unease remained. He banked the fire low, letting the cabin fall into shadow. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the door as though she expected it to open at any moment. They didn't speak again that night. He lay awake on the bed, rifle within reach, while she rested near the fire. The crackle of the logs and the soft whisper of the wind through the eaves were the only sounds. Sometime deep in the night, he thought he heard voices, low, muffled, carried on the air, but when he rose to listen, they were gone. When the morning came, it brought no clarity, only the brittle brightness of the sun on snow and the same unsettled quiet. He stepped outside and scanned the tree line, his breath rising in thin clouds. There were no tracks near the cabin, but in the far distance, just beyond the creek, a narrow line of boot prints trailed into the woods. Fresh. He returned to find her standing at the window, watching him. No words passed between them, but they both knew the stillness of the land was only the pause before something else arrived. The morning light was sharp enough to sting the eyes, cutting clean over the snow-covered hills. He stepped out with his rifle in hand, scanning the open ground. That was when he saw it, nailed to a strip post at the edge of his clearing. A rough plank, letters gouged deep into the wood with a knife. "This land is claimed. Leave or burn." The words were crooked but legible, the kind carved by a steady hand that meant them. He touched the edge of the board, feeling the splintered wood where the blade had bitten. It hadn't been there yesterday. She came up beside him, her breath a faint cloud in the cold. She read the words slowly, her eyes narrowing as the meaning settled. Without speaking, she looked toward the distant trees, as if expecting figures to emerge from them. He studied the tree lean too, searching for movement, but found only the restless sway of bare branches in the wind. Whoever left the sign had done so in silence, without haste. That alone unsettled him more than an outright threat. They followed the ridge later that morning, circling wide to avoid leaving easy tracks. From the high ground, he spotted them, a half-dozen men camped on a flat stretch of land beyond the creek. A wagon stood among them, horses tethered nearby. Their rifles leaned against a log, barrels catching the sun in quick, cold flashes. The men moved with the ease of those who believed themselves unchallenged. One knelt by the fire, stirring a pot. Another sat sharpening a long knife, the scrape of steel faint even at this distance. No one watched the perimeter. They didn't think they needed to. He and the woman lay prone behind a low outcrop, the snow damp through their coats. She pointed to the wagon, muttering something low in her own language before adding in English, "They stay. They take." He nodded once, the truth of it already pressing in. Out here, possession came not from law, but from the will to hold on to what was yours. And theirs was a will sharpened by numbers. Back at the cabin, he began making changes. The woodpile was drawn close against the walls to serve as a barricade. The shutters were reinforced with thick boards. He took stock of his ammunition. 24 cartridges in the tin, another handful loose in his coat pocket. He'd need each one to matter. She watched his work without comment at first, then moved to help. Her injured arm was bound, but she used her other hand to lash together a crude bough from a length of scavenged sinew and a curved branch taken from the tree lean. She worked quickly, testing the pull, sharpening arrow tips against a flat stone. In the glow of late afternoon, they worked side by side. Their movements were efficient, unhurried, as if each understood the other without needing to speak. Once, as he handed her a length of rope, their hands brushed, callous skin meeting callous skin. Neither pulled away. By nightfall, the cabin felt different. The open, vulnerable space had become a stronghold, every corner shaped by the quiet tension that now lived there. They ate little, saving what they could. The fire was kept low, its glow barely touching the walls. It was close to midnight when it came. A sharp snap outside, followed by a muffled curse. He was at the window in an instant, rifle ready. In the half-dark, he caught a glimpse of a man crouched near the wall, one leg caught in a steel trap set earlier along the approach. The man's breath came in harsh bursts, his gloved hands fumbling at the jaws of the trap. The hunter opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He didn't raise the rifle, but held it ready, letting the steel catch what little moonlight there was. "You've got till the count of 3, he said, his voice low. "After that, you lose more than your boot." The man froze, then snarled something under his breath. The hunter began to count, slow and measured. On 2, the man wrenched his leg free, leaving the trap to snap shut on empty air. He stumbled backward, limping into the dark. From beyond the tree lean came the sound of laughter, low, cold, carrying just far enough to be heard. It was the kind of laughter meant to remind a man that he was being watched, measured. He stepped back inside, bolting the door. She was standing near the fire, bow in hand, eyes locked on his. There was no fear in her expression, only the understanding that the waiting was over. The men beyond the trees wouldn't keep to the shadows for long. Dawn came on slow, the light dulled by a sky swollen with snow clouds. The air was still in that way it sometimes was before a storm, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He stood at the window with his rifle in hand, watching the tree-line. Shapes moved there, men on foot, spreading out, rifles cradled in their arms. No more shadows, no more warnings. They had come. The first shot cracked the air, splintering a board on the shutter beside his head. He ducked back, working the rifle's lever with a practice flick, the metal warm against his palm. She was already in position near the rear of the cabin, bow strung, arrows laid out within reach. Neither spoke. More shots followed, dull thuds as the walls took them, with chips and snowflakes swirled through the gaps. He returned fire in steady rhythm, each shot aimed, each recoil biting into his shoulder. From the trees he caught glimpses of faces, grim, tight-lipped, determined. One of them broke from cover, running low toward the cabin with something in his hand. The hunter's shot took him in the leg, dropping him into the snow. The man writhed, but no one came for him. The others kept their distance, firing in measured bursts meant to test the defenses. Then the smoke came, thick, black, pouring from the side where the woodpile leaned against the wall. The men had set a light, and the dry winter would caught fast. The smell of it bit into his lungs. He grabbed a pail of water, dousing what he could from the inside, but the fire hissed and pushed back. She caught his arm, motioning toward the rear door. Her meaning was clear. She could slip out unseen, circle behind them. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. She took her bow and vanished into the pale blur of snow beyond the door. The gunfire at the front grew heavier. He crouched low, firing between the gaps, buying her the time she needed. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint twang of a bowstring. A cry followed. A man falling in the snow beyond his sight. He pressed the advantage, firing until the chamber ran dry. One man broke cover, charging in a blind rush. They collided at the doorway, the impact driving them both into the wall. Fists, elbows, but a rifle, each strike hard, clumsy with rage. The hunter drove the man back with a shove, then slammed the stock of his rifle into his temple. The leader came last, broad-shouldered, face half in by a scarf, eyes cold and fixed. The shot that hit the hunter's shoulder came from him, the force of it staggering him into the doorframe. Pain roared hot, but his grip didn't falter. The leader stepped in close, knife flashing in his hand. Before the blade could fall, she was there, silent, sudden, her knife sinking into the man's side. His eyes widened, breath catching in a sharp, wet gasp. She pulled him down with her weight, the snow outside catching them both as they fell. The others broke then, scattering back into the trees, their shouts fading with distance. The cabin stood, scarred by fire and bullet. The snow around it churned and stained. He stood in the doorway, one hand pressed his shoulder, the other holding the rifle loosely now. She rose from where she had fallen with the leader, her breath quick but steady. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. No words came. None were needed. The fire at the wall had died to a low hiss. The wind picked up, carrying away the smoke, revealing the wide stretch of prairie beyond. The light was breaking through the clouds at last, spilling gold across the snow, turning the blood there into something darker, almost black. They stood side by side, the cold biting at their faces, watching the horizon. There would be others sooner or later. Out here, there always were. But for now, the land was theirs, and the silence that followed was not the kind that threatened. It was the kind that let a person breathe.